Hi, it's April 25th, 2020, here in the year of lockdown. And while we would love to have a live audience, we hope you're out there live, watching us on live stream. Today's topic, this is the second of our Bicentennial Morgan County 2020 lectures. And these highlight the economic sectors of the county through history. Today's topic is going to be the tanneries of Morgan County. I'm Jeanne Mozier. I'm president of the Museum of the Berkeley Springs, and the museum is producing these lectures. And I'm also, along with Lori Hansroth and Stephanie Alamong, part of the Bicentennial team planning all our events of 2020. So, here we go. These waters have a peculiar effect in the process of tanning the leather, which cannot be gained by others, giving to the leather a toughness and durability that cannot be equaled. This is what the news said in March 1888 about the tannery in Berkeley Springs. The world seemed to agree. The sole leather from the first national tannery in Berkeley Springs took a premium at the World's Exposition in New Orleans in 1886, and 4 years later at the same exposition, DeFord's leather won first place. Let's start by examining how tanneries worked. Tanning is the process of converting raw hides into leather. Hides have the ability to absorb tannic acid and other chemicals that prevent them from decaying, making them resistant to wetting and keeping them supple. Tanning permanently alters the protein structure of the skins so that it cannot ever return to raw hide. Tannery workers were cross-trained to do many jobs, and a man could do several different jobs each day. The hides came in from Chicago by railroad cars and were offloaded by hand. The hides were packed in coarse salt to preserve them until they reached the tannery. The salt had to be removed by soaking in water. This also helped restore the moisture that was lost in curing. Next, the hides were scraped to remove the excess flesh. This was called fleshing. The hides were then soaked in lime to remove the hair. The hair was sold by the pound to be used by plasterers. The hides were then soaked in vats where they were layered with ground oak bark, which provided the tannin. The concentration of tannin was increased as they were transferred to different vats every so many days. It took about 3 weeks to complete this process. Done by hand, it was a heavy job that used poles with hooks on the end. It was all done in the beam house. So the photo of the vats that we have was actually from Paw Paw, the Paw Paw tannery, and it was taken in 1930 after a fire at the tannery. Otherwise, these vats in Paw Paw and here in Berkeley Springs would have been inside a building. After they were scoured, bleached, and oiled, hides were placed in the drying sheds, and when they were good and dry, they were sponged with sheepskin cloths to add the color. Then they were rolled to make them shine. Now they were ready for the cutting plant. The process I just outlined explains several aspects of the industry as it was in Morgan County. It was more convenient to have the tanneries located near the bark and ship in the hides from Chicago. Morgan County had water, the unique spring water in Berkeley Springs, the Potomac River in Paw Paw. Shipping was needed. Both locations had the railroad and the canal. Labor was needed, a climate that offered splendid drying conditions for most of the year, and most importantly, an abundant source of oak bark. Providing bark for the tannery was a good source of cash income for country folks in Morgan County, which in the late 19th century was heavily wooded. Bark, especially oak, was a prime ingredient of the tannery's success in the county. As mentioned, bark was used to tan the hides. Thousands of pounds were peeled, carted into town, and sold by country folk up through May. It was in Berkeley Springs, it was stored in bark sheds that were spread over a couple of blocks of downtown. In 1888, a dispute over bark led to the county's first murder in a decade, but more about that later. In Berkeley Springs, the first tannery was a small operation started in 1822 and called Robert Chew's Tab House. I have no idea what that means, but that was the name. It was located, as the tannery operation continued to be until it ended, on the lot occupied by the Star Theater today. Benjamin DeFord bought Robert Chew's Tab House just before the war in 1860. DeFord was based in Baltimore and eventually owned tanneries in several Virginia locations, including Luray, where the DeFord tannery operated through 1950. The pictures you're seeing now are the tannery buildings as they were on Washington Street. Now today, Washington Street is the main street in Berkeley Springs, and the tanneries occupied most of several blocks north of Berkeley Springs State Park. DeFord's First National had a complicated relationship with life in Berkeley Springs. After the Civil War, the town was divided between two conflicting economic forces. Hotels and bathhouses dominated the streets surrounding the warm mineral springs, but they were slow to recover business after the war, because before the war, Berkeley Springs had been a southern resort. That ended with the Civil War. The buildings of DeFord's tannery bumped up against them, filling the area beginning at the alley just a half block north of the park on Washington Street and continuing north on Washington another block or two. One of the historic facts that this photo makes clear is why Wilkes Street was the main street into town, not Washington Street, until the mid-20th century. Obviously, in the late Victorian period, you wouldn't want all your hotel guests driving past the tanneries. Until the railroad spur into town in 1888, out-of-town guests made their way from the train to the baths and hotels by exiting the train at Sir John's along the Potomac and taking a stagecoach down the mountain and then along Wilkes Street. Bark sheds were eventually built in several locations downtown, including on today's Ice House land. And that's the picture you're seeing now, is the giant bark house that was on the Ice House lot. The famous 1889 Murray print overlooking downtown Berkeley Springs showed two tannery smokestacks. The previous year, in 1888, DeFord had built the largest smokestack in West Virginia, 103 feet tall. And this was in the middle of downtown Berkeley Springs. Trouble started in tannery life in 1875. By then, the tannery was the largest industry in town. It provided jobs. It provided an outlet for the bark. It undertook community tasks and donated generously to various churches and civic causes. The hotel industry at the same time was improving, and a population of prosperous guests was once again the norm. The owners of the Fairfax Hotel, which then occupied the north side of Fairfax Street, facing the park, filed a lawsuit against the tannery in 1875, claiming that the smell and the pollution were hurting hotel business. The larger Berkeley Springs Hotel, which was located on the south side of the park, did not join in the lawsuit. When David Hunter Strother sold the Berkeley Springs Hotel a few years earlier, DeFord was both a stockholder and on the board of directors of the company that bought the hotel. In addition, its more distant location on the other side of the park meant there was less impact of smell and polluted water on the hotel. The suit failed, but was filed again a decade later. Here's another picture of the tannery block of all of the tannery buildings stretched out along Washington Street. The tannery expanded dramatically in the 1880s, at the same time that Berkeley Springs was once again becoming a fashionable summer resort. In 1885, full capacity at the tannery was 800 sides a week. By 1888, it was 10 times that, 8,000 tan sides a week. County Court at this time gave a permit for the tannery to build more vats. DeFord plows cleared the streets of snow. They put up a town bell to ring hours through the night. The tannery whistle was used to signal fire, and the first Bath fire truck was built at the tannery. DeFord bought furniture for the Masonic Lodge, chartered in 1890, and it was named for him. Today, it remains the DeFord Masonic Lodge. For almost 2 decades, most matters, public, civic, or religious, were cleared with DeFord, since most asked for money. By 1889, the tannery operated at full blast. Fire burned in a new furnace they had built, smoke was rolling out of the high smokestack, the bark mill moved to a new building, and the tannery soon increased to double capacity. It employed more men. It was time for a murder. It was the first murder in 10 years. On a September day, 3/4 of a mile south of town on what was then called Winchester Grade Road, 3 men from Timber Ridge came to town. Samuel Moore, who was the shooter, James Stotler, who was the victim, and Dorsey Mason, who was shot in the leg. Moore accused the other 2 of stealing his bark. They denied it. Several times during the day, they had quarrels in town. About 4 p.m., Stotler and Mason started home, but decided to wait and waylay Moore. They stopped him on the road, and they wanted to settle the issue. Stotler tried to get on the wagon. He was warned off by Moore. He stepped off the wagon, and then Moore shot him twice with a revolver, once in the neck and once on the top of the head. Moore whipped up his horses and shot Mason in the leg as he drove past. Stotler died. Moore gave no resistance when the police captured him and brought him to jail. Now, in light of honest reporting, the picture you're seeing is not actually Samuel Moore, the shooter, but It's the right time frame, it's what a bark wagon would look like, and it's what a guy driving the bark wagon would look like. So we'll all pretend. It's a reenactment. In 1885, DeFord unknowingly put another nail in his coffin. He was an active supporter of bringing a spur of the railroad directly into town. As president of Berkeley Springs and Potomac Railroad, he agreed with the B&O to connect their two lines. It finally happened at the end of 1888. Ironically, the tannery suffered when the railroad came to town. It had kept the price of bark low for choice chestnut oak. Brokers now offered more and shipped it to other markets. DeFord had gotten a long bark shed built in the north end of town near the depot. Then it hurt him when the price of bark went up. At the same time, the railroad spur directly into town greatly benefited the hotels. People no longer had to endure the uncomfortable stagecoach ride from Sir John's. In 1890, the local newspaper labeled the Ford Tannery the largest in the world, in a bit of hyperbole. At the same time, a new lawsuit was filed, and indictments were handed down this time, and the suit was eventually tried, and DeFord lost. The list of complaints was long, and it included whistleblowing and another smokestack being built, odors from decaying flesh scraped from animal hides caused complaints from the public and from hotel owners, drainage from tannery vats killed fish in Warm Springs Run and discolored it. The unsightliness of overflowing bark sheds and the tallest smokestack in the state affected public opinion. Hotel guests were obliged to carry a cloth to dust the soot from the tannery smokestack off the grove benches and hotel porch chairs. Anti-tannery forces gained momentum. The perfect storm finally climaxed in 1897. Benjamin DeFord died. The U.S. Senate voted a duty on hides, which had been duty-free since 1872. Wind destroyed the hide house. Tannery boys began leaving town as business declined. The tannery finally closed in 1898. Property was sold in 1899, and over the next decade or so, the buildings were damaged by fire or razed, opening blocks of downtown for other commercial development, some of which still stands today. Other storage buildings were taken over by newly emerging industries, sand mining and tomato canning. Berkeley Springs saw a tremendous economic shift as one century ended and another began. The tannery was gone, the Berkeley Springs Hotel burned, and a couple years later, so did the Fairfax. The hotel industry eventually revived. The tannery never did. Now, the story in Paw Paw was different, possibly because there was no competing hotel industry that had a very different view of what town life should be. Here's a picture of the Paw Paw Tannery, which, as you can see, was quite an expansive operation. Paw Paw began as a canal and railroad town. During the Civil War, it was the site of a large Union encampment because of these transportation assets. In 1868, Joseph B. Hoyt and Company of New York was attracted to the area because of the amount of oak tanning bark that was being shipped from the railroad station here. They established the tannery. Paw Paw had all the other necessary attributes: water, transportation, and labor. Bark was the deciding factor. The farmers and the lumbermen in the area cut timbers for the railroad ties and peeled the bark for the tanneries. Bark came from all over the area by various means. Some came up from Great Cacapon on canal boats. Bark was unloaded from the boats onto horse-drawn wagons, crossed the river by ferry or ford, and arrived at the tannery. Others brought the bark in directly by railroad cars, and still others by horse and wagon from the forests. Fayweather and Ledoux eventually took over the operation from their partner Hoyt. In 1893, they in turn were succeeded by the United States Leather Company, which was one of the original companies listed on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It was originally capitalized at the equivalent of $3 billion in current worth. Finally, the Paw Paw Tannery was owned by the Union Tanning Company, a subsidiary of the United States Leather Company and its allied interests. Although the tannery was operated by 4 different companies during its 83 years, it always provided steady work for Paw Paw citizens. By 1885, the tannery employed 100 hands and was soon one of the largest in the nation. J.J. Hetzel, its manager, was the Morgan County representative to the state legislature. In 1887, there were 180 employed, and Paw Paw was the largest town in Morgan County with 1,000 residents, making up almost 20% of the county's population. Even more than DeFord, the J.B. Hoyt & Company was very civic-minded. They built a schoolhouse on the tannery property for the children of the village. They built houses for their workers. In 1902, they brought a ferry boat down from Cumberland to be used at Paw Paw. In 1912, the tannery provided electric lights, lighting the grounds and buildings, as well as powering the operation. The town did not get electric until 1928. A water tower was built in 1933 after a fire a few years earlier destroyed 2 of the 5 units that housed the vats used to soak the hides. They were soon rebuilt. The tower remained as a landmark until October 1st, 2011, when it was removed. The disastrous 1936 flood damaged the tannery. Company houses needed to be replaced, and boys were hired to recover hides that washed down the river. Attractive and solid double houses were built facing the railroad and remain as one of the most desirable places in town to live, now known as Louis Lane. During the 1930s, the tannery was the largest in the world making belt leather. A World War I ship cargo of this leather sank and was salvaged 17 years later in perfect condition. This episode was the subject of a Lowell Thomas radio broadcast entitled 17 Years Under the Sea. In 1939, the Union Tanning Company expanded, moving from New Jersey a stamping plant that cut shoe soles. More houses were built on Mozier Avenue in town for the new arrivals. For decades, the people of Paw Paw were governed by the tannery whistles. The first one was heard at 5:30 a.m. as a wake-up call. The 7 a.m. whistle announced work was beginning. Lunch started with a whistle at noon and ended with a back-to-work blast at 1 p.m. The 4 p.m. whistle marked the end of the day. World War II introduced women to the cut sole plant. About 450 were employed. At one time, they operated a double shift. The plant closed in December 1951 after workers voted to unionize. By then, Genuine leather was being replaced by a man-made synthetic called neolite, and tanning became a thing of the past. Although the tannery buildings in Paw Paw served other manufacturers over the years, they have since been torn down. The property is now used by the owner as pasture land. The smell that so outraged Berkeley Springs had a different unfolding. During the operating years, the odor was tolerated because it meant jobs. Miraculously, when the tannery was finally closed, the Avon Cosmetic Company used the factory as a temporary home until a new one could be built in Newark, Delaware. They changed the scent of Paw Paw. Unlike Berkeley Springs, where hotels revived and other industries emerged, returning the town to prosperity, that hasn't happened yet in Paw Paw. The tannery kept Paw Paw booming during the Depression and World War II, but once it ended, Paw Paw declined in both population and economic health. Never again would Morgan County be on the world stage for its leather, and only the future can tell whether Paw Paw will ever again be the largest and most prosperous town in the county.